this next session, you'll see Mara Menzies being interviewed by Amber Beard. If you enjoy the session, take a selfie and share your digital festival experience on our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram accounts to encourage your friends to join in too. So now, please give a virtual welcome to Mara Menzies.
Welcome to a storytelling about the legacy of colonialism and slavery. Some people like to think that what happened in the past stays in the past. But we all know that the world doesn't really work like that. I have a story for you. There was a young black man who came to Edinburgh for a meeting. He sat down at a cafe out on the high street, and the waiter pulled out his seat and called him sir. He was struck with how equal he felt because he had never encountered such hospitality before. There was another young black man who found his way to the Grass Market, a beautiful, enjoyable part of this city. He had the audacity to speak to a white woman, an act for which he was stabbed to death, and despite the many eyewitnesses, the known identities of the killers, nobody was ever brought to justice. The first story took place in 1846, 173 years ago. The young man was Sir Frederick Douglass. He had escaped slavery in the Americas and was one of the foremost anti-slavery campaigners of his time. The second story took place in 1989, just 30 years ago. The young man was Ahmed Sheikh, a promising young student from Somalia. It's surprising how little we've moved forward. It's not surprising how little we talk about it. You see, we're Scottish. We like to talk about how we wanted to remain, how we sent them homewards, how we led the fight to abolish slavery. We don't like to talk about the more difficult things, how we were the majority shareholders in the plantations, how 70% of the Jamaican telephone directory is made up of Scottish names, how many families received millions of pounds in compensation for the loss of their human property. We especially don't like to talk about how portraying black people as subhuman was essential for the success of the colonies and the slave trade, and how in many ways that narrative is perpetuated to this day. But who would want to speak about things like that?
Good afternoon and welcome to the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. My name's Amber Beard and this afternoon I'm interviewing Mara Menzies, who is the author of Blood and Gold, A Journey of Shadows. Hi Mara, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Now, this is a book which I read with a lot of interest, actually, because on the surface, it seems almost like a children's book of children's sort of almost African or African continent fairy stories or tales or morality tales. But actually, it's actually quite a bit deeper than that, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, my day job, if you like, is I'm a performance storyteller. So, and when I tell stories to live audiences, you never know who's going to be in the audience. Sometimes they're family audiences, and the best stories are the ones that hit people regardless of what age they're at. And I've never been the kind of storyteller to just kind of pander to the little ones, if you like. I feel that, young people, children are perfectly capable of understanding really important human emotions, and issues that affect us, like injustice and oppression. So regardless of what the story is, the children will understand it at one level, adults will understand it at a very different level. The teenagers, there's also something in it for them. But yes, so I think this book is sort of pitched at maybe my daughter's age, I suppose, which she's 14 plus, because I felt that it was a book that I really wanted her to be able to read and her friends. So yes, it's done in this lovely fairy tale style. However, the themes and the content and I suppose the inspirations behind it are also looking at quite wide, quite broad issues that affect the world today. They affect Scotland, which a lot of people might not think that these issues exist here, but actually these issues exist across the entire world and affect people in various communities.
So you should, if you don't mind, just explain what your actual heritage and background is for, because you have an ever so slight Scottish accent, and it would be just interesting because it's very similar to your character in the book. in fact?
Yeah, so I was born in Scotland, and then at a few months old, I went to live in Kenya, and I grew up in Kenya, right on the Indian Ocean, and then we moved back to a flat in Morningside in Edinburgh when I was about 13 years old. But I have a really strong relationship with both Kenya and Scotland, and even though I'm based here in Edinburgh, I do visit Kenya every year. I make sure that I take my children there because I think it's really important to remain rooted and to kind of understand history and heritage. And my mother is Kenyan, and she came to Scotland in the 60s to study nursing. And she has always had this very, very strong connection to her African culture. So I guess that's something that she has passed down to me, and hopefully I can pass down to my children as well.
Mm. And talking of obviously Scottish heritage, you have mentioned in other interviews that I've watched about Scottish colonialism and how that has sort of influenced a lot of the stories that you've told. How does that sort of weave in with all the other bits and pieces in the book?
I think I've had a really interesting experience of living in a country like Kenya, which was obviously a colonized country, and then moving here and living in Scotland, and then we hear about sort of Scotland's role in the transatlantic slave trade and Scotland's role in the plantations, and certainly there were a lot of Scottish people who were very heavily involved, who were at the top level in the colonial governments across the entire world. So Scotland's role in colonialism is huge, it's vast, and not a lot of people are aware of that as well. It's quite easy to put the blame somewhere else. But yes, I think one of the things that fascinated me also is that we really don't talk about it. And growing up in Kenya, I went to a few different schools, but one of the schools I went to was a British school. And, the history that we learned at the British school was, I think the thing that was stuck out most clearly was a song about 1066. So we were learning an awful lot about British history. We weren't, but the acceptable British history. And we learned nothing actually about Kenyan history. And the role that Britain played in that in that era, and also how a lot of the laws, a lot of the systems, a lot of the policies and processes that exist in Kenya to this day are actually based on what was introduced by the British colonial government. And a lot of the time that does not work for a Kenyan population. And so there's a lot of things that also need to change in Kenya, but we haven't quite reached that point yet.
Do you think it will reach that point at any time, or do you think this might be something which is ongoing for more generations to come?
I think definitely for more generations to come. I think change is coming slowly, but purely because I think a lot more people are speaking about these stories, and that truth is slowly being uncovered. I mean, certainly if you're looking at it from the Kenyan perspective, we're hearing more stories about the Mau Mau fighters. We hear about the records that have been destroyed by the British government. We've got authors. I think there's the Gulag by, oh gosh, I've forgotten her name, but Catherine Elson, but she really brought an awful lot of issues to light about the UK's role in Kenya, and just the stories that you gather from Kenyan people themselves. And there's legal cases against the British government, and all of these things are sort of slowly coming to light. And I think as people begin to understand more about that history, then it has to grow. And that's, I think, one of the issues that I explore a lot in the book is this, is one of the legacies of colonialism is this stripping away of indigenous culture, is getting rid of history and practices that have existed for hundreds, thousands of years, because that is primitive and barbaric. And if you want to develop and you want to progress and move forward, you're actually better off adopting a more Western lifestyle, which is a huge issue in Kenya to this day. Very, very few people still wear the traditional dress. A lot of the names are Christian names. A lot of parents don't ever wish to give their children a lot of tribal names. And so these are things that kind of creep in. And if you're not proud of where you come from and who you come from, then you're really hiding something very, very important. And it's necessary to reach back into history, learn what you can, embrace what you can, keep what you can of the good things, but don't shy away from the bad things, because anything negative will also, everything is a gift, whether it's a lesson to be learned and how to move forward into the future. So yeah, certainly that's something that I do explore in the book.
So how did this book come about then? How did you say that you're a performance artist, so how did this whole project begin?
So this is my first novel, and it came about because in 2019 I had a show. The show Blood and Gold was at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival as part of the Made in Scotland showcase, and my publishers, Berlin, Jan Rutherford, came to see the show, and she really liked it, and she approached me last year and asked if I had ever considered turning it into a novel. And of course, there were very few live performances going on last year, so I thought, well, no, I haven't. However, I would be quite interested in exploring a different way of telling a story, of sharing a story. So when Jan did approach me, I think if I had sent anybody the script that we were using for the Fringe, no publisher could possibly have been interested, because really a storyteller's script, we don't write down the story and then memorize it. You just have storyboards or mind maps and squiggles and doodles on paper, and you know really just the skeleton, because ultimately the audience is the most important part of telling the story, and they really influence and shape how that story is told, which of course is a very, very different thing to literature, where the story is there. I mean, everybody will receive it in a slightly different way, but the words cannot change once they are down in paper and in print. Then that is how they will stay. But every single storytelling performance is going to be slightly different, because you gauge the mood of the audience, you gauge just the feeling and who's there and how they are best going to engage with you and that particular story. So yes, that was how it came about, because I think having seen the show, Jan was able to see actually beyond into the story and how it actually could be turned into something a little bit different. So that's how it came about.
And did you find the process of having to be disciplined and actually write it down as a proper story, rather than, as you say, a mind map or a reminder here or a reminder there? Was that a difficult process to then kind of come on and do if this was the first time that you've written a book?
Yes, is the simple answer to that. It was very difficult, actually, especially at the beginning, because, you know, I think everybody feels I have a story, I have a book inside me, and everybody wants to write this book. And I've certainly thought that before, you know, I'd love to have a book. But actually doing it is a very, very different thing. So I sat down at my desk with my laptop, ready to launch into this story. And I sat and nothing happened. It was, and then it was quite frightening, because of course, once you speak with the publishers and you have an arrangement that you're going to submit by a certain chunk by a certain period of time, there's this pressure, you know, you have to do it. And when it comes to work and when it comes to story, I'm very responsible. I take it very personally, and I really, really want to make sure it's the best that it can possibly be. I don't like to rush things too much when it comes to the crafting of the story, because it's really important. If you get it wrong, if you get it, or not even wrong, just something slightly off key, people sense it and people know it, and then they begin to question everything else around it. So it's really important to get it right. So in the end, what I did was I'm a storyteller, so I told the story. I use this wonderful technology that we have, the voice to text. So I spoke my story, and then the computer did its job, and inevitably there were a lot of mistakes, and then I would go through it line by line, and I would then take that line and then enhance it and try to bring it to life. I would introduce dialogue, because in the performance there is no dialogue. I added in names of characters, because in the performance there are no names, because the audience imagines themselves as these characters, I suppose. So a lot of changes, and also when you're telling the story, you're using your physicality. You know, the story is told through your facial expressions, through your fingers, through everything, and that can't happen in the book. So everything needs to be described. You know, when Jeddah is upset, you need to make people feel that, and when you're telling a story, they feel that by watching your face. And you know, if they see that you're incredibly upset, then that emotion it transfers over to them. So yeah, really had to go into another way of finding the words, because ultimately the words in the written form are far, far more important than words in the performing side of telling a story.
The girl was still young, just leaving her childhood behind. Her mother became sick. It was a creeping, cowardly sickness. the kind that steals you piece by piece. It started by sucking the energy from her bones. It moved to taking the shimmer from her skin, and slowly it started to steal the sparkle from her eyes. And as the mother grew weaker and weaker, she began to wonder how she could cram a lifetime of learning, of teaching, of sharing into just a few short months. There were things that her daughter needed to know, important things. And so the nature of her stories began to change. She spoke about a shadow man, a creature who in one story appeared as a great cloud of dust. In another, he was a slithering creature, and in yet another, a beautiful golden angel. But the girl was young, and she did not understand these stories. The mother grew weaker and weaker still, until she realized there was no time left. She took a box, and into that box she poured in her stories, histories, legends, myths, folk tales, languages, memories, ideas, inspirations. She poured them in and closed the lid. And her daughter came skipping into the room, and her mother gifted her the box. But at that moment, she saw that death had entered the room, and she pleaded for just a little more time. And death took pity on the woman, and she held her daughter close to her. You take the high road, I must now take the low road.
So just give us a little précis of what the book of what Blood and Gold is about. And is it really about yourself and your mother and her stories? That's what I kind of thought as I was going through it. So just tell the audience that we have here just a little potted description of what Blood and Gold's about.
So I structured it around this mother, and the mother is ill, she's dying, and she has a daughter. And in my head, they live in Scotland because that is what I know. And but although in the book it's never mentioned that it's Scotland, and her African heritage is also never mentioned, it's probably shown in the illustrations more, but in the story it's never told. But this dying mother realizes that her time is passing very quickly, and she begins to worry and wonder about how her daughter is going to grow up, because she always tells her daughter these stories. And then she really wants her daughter to identify with her history and her heritage and her place in the world and who and why and all of these things. And so she decides to put her stories into a box. So she pours them in, story after story. And then when she passes away, she hands the box over to her daughter. And then the daughter, at some point opens this box. But of course, along the way, it's never that easy. There's a character called the Shadow Man. And the Shadow Man is quite symbolic. Some people who've read the book or seen the show, they're never 100% certain who this Shadow Man character is. But I suppose in many ways, Shadow Man might be described as fear, but that fear, that little voice that lives inside us. And, it's a tiny death that strips away at our confidence, that strips away at our thoughts of who we are and the things that we like and the things that we're good at. But then equally, it makes us afraid of other people. That's the othering that comes in. So, be careful of Amber because she wears glasses, and, people who wear glasses might be like this. So it's just that little voice that kind of speaks to us constantly. And so that's the Shadow Man. And the Shadow Man is aware of the power of the stories in this box and does not want the girl to open the box. And so actively tries to stop her, tries to make her feel that this box must never be opened. So then the stories, they come flying out, and the stories sort of deal with a lot of different things. The inspirations of my mother and my grandparents, and I guess thinking of my daughter and how she's growing up in Scotland are huge as well as my own experiences of coming at the age of 13. It's quite a critical age in a young woman's life, and my experiences of going from rural Kenya to Edinburgh, which is still a city, a very small city, but a city nonetheless. and just sort of that juxtaposition of the duality of worlds and life, and how how we kind of how we navigate that transition between how people live, I suppose, because obviously life in Kenya is very, very different to life here. So that is the structure of the story.
And it was then that the shadow man who exists in the cracks in the walls spotted an opportunity. He slithered out across the floor into her bedroom. He crept up behind her mirror, so as she gazed at her reflection, he gazed back. Your hair is a mess. It would be better off straight. Ooh, look at those curves. Thin is in. What? You have an opinion? Perhaps you should keep it to yourself. And the girl listened to these words, taking them deep into her. When one day there was a knock on the door, and when she opened it, there was Auntie. Daughter! You think that I have not been watching you, huh? Look at your hair. You have changed. Look at your body. You have changed.
Just going back to the shadow man, because I had him a bit of a sort of, to begin with, I thought, well, he's a bit like the sort of bogeyman who hides under the bed, you know, that you're always terrified of when you're a child. But I actually then, maybe just in my own head, read in, I've just written some notes down. I also thought he was quite a lot of other people as well. He was government, he was colonialism, he was slavery, he was lots of other very insidious things, which, you know, he wasn't just the little voice in Jeddah's head saying, you know, are you good enough? Do you look nice? You know, do your friends like you? I thought that, you know, when she went into the other worlds, that the worlds of the stories, that he actually represented lots of other things as well, not just necessarily sort of her little voice in her head.
No, absolutely not. It's, you know, I think that's why the Shadow Man character is quite complex, but at the same time, regardless of where he appears in the story, whether it's in her real world, whether it's in her imagination, whether it's when she actually enters the world of the stories, they all sort of fit together. You recognize exactly who that Shadow Man is in each particular situation, but there's nothing good or pleasant about the Shadow Man, but sometimes he speaks that way. And even when Rahami is telling her daughter these stories, because she changes the stories from these lovely fairy tales and legends and stories of the Selkies and stories of, you know, magic needles and chickens and eagles, she begins to change the story to try and warn her daughter that the Shadow Man exists. And, you know, and in the book I say, you know, he changes from this slithering creature to a cloud of dust to a beautiful golden angel. So there are lots of ways that the Shadow Man appears throughout the story. But even just, I guess, even as us as people, the Shadow Man appears in lots of ways. You know, we might be tricked and fooled by the Shadow Man because we see this beautiful thing, but actually there's something really dark at its core. So it's I suppose just being aware of it. And like you say, you know, the government is supposed to represent the people. However, we have to be aware of government and look beyond the words, look beyond the golden angel, look beyond and actually see what is actually being said and what is at the core of everything. So yes, the Shadow Man is a complicated character.
The other thing that struck me, given your dual heritage, is that the Celts are great storytellers as well. I mean, it's a very Celtic thing. I was brought up in Ireland, and it was a great tradition of after a dinner or after a party or whatever, there would be a tradition of you were expected to tell a story, you know. So I had 2 or 3 that I could do off pat. Have you found that in Scotland as well? Is that a thing?
It is indeed. In fact, it was quite interesting. I became a storyteller about 13 or 14 years ago. And when I grew up in Kenya, we lived in quite a rural part. We didn't grow up in a city. So and we didn't have a television. So a lot of the time when people refer to childhood TV programs, whoosh, I have no idea what they're referring to. And so a lot of the time it was dinners, and my grandmother, my mother would all tell stories. We were surrounded by stories. And so that was very normal. And then, of course, as a teenager, moved here, suddenly we had television, and that storytelling tradition, it disappeared, but I never really noticed it had gone. And it was when I had a daughter, and I wanted this daughter to really understand her Kenyan heritage and African heritage, and the best way was through stories. And it was through this process that I discovered the Scottish Storytelling Centre, which we are gifted with here in Scotland. And then suddenly I heard all these amazing storytellers from very different parts of Scotland, the Glaswegian storytellers, and had to listen hard, and the Orcadian storytellers, and the storytellers from the Isle of Skye, the Gaelic storytellers, and just people who have migrated to Scotland. And they bring their culture with them, and these are reflected in the stories that they tell. And I'm very performative. I use my physicality enormously, but some of my favorite storytellers are the quiet ones who sit on a seat, and yet you are captivated by every single word that they say. So the different styles of storytelling are also really, really important and really fascinating, because they reach us in different ways.
Well, I think that's probably a very good time for you perhaps to tell us a story. Yes, because I think we probably all like that. We're dying to hear it now, especially coming from yourself, having read them. So perhaps you would do us a little storytelling, and maybe if you could give us a little preamble beforehand of the sort of context of this, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to be reading from a chapter, and it is called How Much for a Priceless Bird. And actually this chapter is really, it's kind of exploring a little bit what I spoke of before, which is about this stripping away of culture and dismissing indigenous knowledge, tacit knowledge, and in trying to embrace something else. So, a lot of the time people will go to Kenya, and they'll go to the beach and they'll go on safari, but actually they return home and they know absolutely nothing about Kenya. So that was maybe the inspiration behind this story. And where we are is that we have a village, and there's a chief, and some visitors come to this village, and they show the usual hospitality, but the visitors stay on, and then soon it becomes apparent to the chief that they have no intention of leaving, and they don't. They throw everybody out of their homes. They take over their homes, and then they propose something to the chief. Because each village has got this bird, and this bird represents everything, all knowledge that the community has, and its feathers shimmer and sparkle with the culture, with the stories of battles, of marriages, of all the wonderful things that have happened, all the terrible things that have happened. But it's the keeper of knowledge, the keeper of tradition is this bird. And they have asked the chief to bring them this bird. And he resisted for a while, but now he has this bird with him. The chief stood before a council of strangers with his bag by his side. "Do you have it?" they asked. "Yes," he replied. He placed the bag gently on the ground and had just started to open it when he paused. He raised his head and questioned, "Just a look, right?" They smiled at him. Just a look. He opened the bag and gently took out the bird and raised it towards them. Jeddah felt sick. She knew deep inside her that this was very wrong, but despite her fears, she longed to know more. The council approached him, their eyes wide and eager. They reached out their fingers to touch the bird, but the chief resisted. "Only a look," he reminded them. They crowded around him, and he began to feel extremely uncomfortable. They pressed him. "Come on, just one touch. We will give you more land." He heard the honey-coated words repeating over and over again, "Just a touch." He considered how much influence and power he stood to gain. He knew his family would be secure. He thought that over time, he would be able to return the village to its former glory, so he agreed. He allowed their grubby fingers to caress the shimmering feathers of the bird, but the more they touched, the greedier they became. They wanted more. Their desire overcame them. Each one wanted to hold the precious bird, so they tried to prise it from his hands. No, they will hurt it, Jeddah cried, horrified as her imagination played out the scene in front of her. The old woman could not stop. They did. Even though Chief Bohero held on, they grabbed at the bird's wings. They pulled hard, ripping the feathers out of its flesh. The bird cried out in agony. The chief began to shout, but his words were drowned out as they screamed, "Get the bird! Give us the bird! We must have it!" Grasping hands tore at it. Delicate feathers that had lost their gleam fell to the floor. A snapping sound indicated the bird's legs had been broken. It desperately tried to flee, managing to find a gap in the throng, and with a final push, it broke away, leaving fistfuls of feathers in the stranger's hands. The old woman stopped speaking and sighed softly. The heartbreaking shrieks of the little bird resounded in Jeddah's mind, and she was tortured by the image. How could the chief do that? The old woman's gnarled and crooked fingers scratched at her legs. He wondered the same thing too. "I hope he never finds peace. I hope that they betray him and make him suffer," Jeddah cried angrily. They didn't have to do much at all. He carried that burden himself. No weight is heavier than a man's own shame. The chief saw the bird fly into a nearby thorn bush and drag itself along the ground to safety. Its vibrant colors were a poor reflection of its former glory, every inch smeared with blood. He reached out a hand and called gently, but the bird refused to approach him. He was filled with guilt. The history of his world was broken and he was responsible. The stranger's offer of land was stained with blood, and he now fully understood their intentions. But as he wondered if there was still time to leave and join the rebels in destroying their increasingly numerous strongholds, they asked for his help. They wanted him to keep the peace and prove his loyalty. They promised more land if he did. Without knowing why, the chief found himself agreeing. What a coward! Surely they now know he will do anything they ask. Of course. They praised him and welcomed him into their fold. They grinned and asked if he might help them find the rebels to negotiate a truce. Surely he can't trust them. Jeddah immediately thought of Auntie, who, when she disapproved of something, would say, you are moving from a hornet's nest to the jaws of a crocodile. The chief could not refuse. He was a traitor, but in truth he had no information. To be of value, he knew he had to give them something. He thought of the bird. He had placed it in the cage in secrecy. Nobody had seen him, unless, of course, he had been followed. Yes, that was it. The idea began to grow in his mind, so much so that he started to believe it himself. He went to the council and announced, "My friends, earlier someone tried to steal the bird from me. The person who stole the bird must be a rebel."
But there is a line, an invisible line that separates the world of the humans from the world of darkness. And across this line, a shadow was watching. The more he watched, the more he craved, the more he desired to own and possess her. But he knew that he could not simply cross over into the world of the humans, so he came up with a plan. He first visited the land of the recently deceased, and there he found a carpenter with beautiful, magnificent hands. Nipem kono yako na tamani mwanamke nipem kono yako. And he took those hands and attached them to his own. He continued through the land of the recently deceased and found a young athlete, strong, muscular thighs. Yes. Nipe miguu yako na tamani mwanamke nipe miguu yako. And he took those legs and attached them to his form. He continued around, nipe nywele yako, nipe pua yako, nipe macho yako, nipe tumbo yako, nipe. He gathered as much as he needed, and soon he was almost ready. There was one thing missing, a voice to seduce the humans. Could you say hello? We'll think about that one. Yes? A voice to seduce the humans. Who has got his voice? Oh, yes! He took that voice, placed it into his throat, and he was ready. He adorned himself with clothes stitched together with gold and silver thread, and he stepped across the line. When he arrived, the people could not get enough. He walked like a god, danced like a demon. He showered them with gifts and praise, and they forgot themselves completely. Even the giver of joy was seduced by his beauty and power. But it's hard work pretending to be something that you're not.
You know, I have two children, and as parents, the one thing that we want is to keep our children safe. And we trust that these places that we send them, we trust that whatever situation they find themselves in, that somebody's going to help them, that they're going to be okay, that they're going to be welcomed and treated fairly and equally. And that is not often the case. And sometimes, and the tragic thing is that when there's no reason for it whatsoever, you know, somebody is just living their life, and still that's not good enough. You know, still something terrible has to happen. So it's you know, when I was putting these stories together, though, it's really looking at a lot of different things. I feel that sometimes the conversation about the legacy of colonialism and slavery is so difficult for people to have, because it comes across as be either finger pointing or the blame, and somebody has to be responsible. And of course, nobody wants to be responsible. And it happened so long ago. And, you know, how can we fix things now? It's, you know, it doesn't really affect us, although it actually does. And I think sometimes the barriers go up because people, they're just not comfortable talking about it. And an allegory that I like to use is that I think if you want somebody to walk across a tightrope, you can get them up the ladder. But at that point, that pivotal point, they have a decision to make. Do they cross, or do they just come back down the ladder? And they're likely to cross despite how uncomfortable they feel, if they feel a sense of being supported. But if they feel that there is zero support, if they feel that it's dangerous and so awful, they're just going to climb back down. And so I think that we need to have these uncomfortable conversations, but we need to have them in a way that people don't feel that they are restricted, that people don't feel that the second they say a truth, or not even a truth, but just something that they feel, they're going to be condemned for feeling a certain way. And I think that we really need to have those conversations opened much, much wider. And this was a way of perhaps doing that in a different way, using myth and fantasy. So it's not anybody's story. It's not any particular truth. And yet within it, there are an awful lot of truths, because every single story is rooted in history, in my own personal family history, in real life events. I've made nothing up. I have just crafted the story around real world events.
His parents began to wonder that perhaps this boy could be the one to rid the land of poison. But to do that, he needed skills, knowledge and experience, something that he could not find in his own land. But they knew of the perfect place. Oh yes, the land in the sky. Stories abounded of this place. Oh, it was beautiful. Knowledge and opportunity at every turn. Oh, it was far. So they saved as much gold as they could. And when the young boy was of age, they gave him a nice little pasta ragu. They gave him a pouch full of gold, and they sent him on his way. He marched across those shimmering sands. He came to mountains up and down. He swam over raging rivers. He walked over the rolling plains when in the distance, he saw a rope hanging from the sky. He headed for that rope and started to climb higher and higher. But the land in the sky does not accept people too easily. And when they saw this young man approach, they sent wind and rain to knock him off. He clung on with every ounce of energy that he had. And when the wind and rain had eased, he continued to climb. Higher, higher. But the land in the sky does not accept people too easily. When they saw him continuing to climb, they took oil and poured it down that rope. He began to slip and slide, but he gripped on with his fingernails and his teeth. The sun dried up that oil, and he continued to climb. They sent hornets that stung his shoulders, his legs, his fingers. He cried out with pain, but he continued to climb. And just as he was approaching the entrance, they set fire to that rope. When he saw it beginning to burn, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the gold. When they saw its gleam, they hauled the young man up and they welcomed him in.
Slavery was something that came very much to the fore a few months ago, you know, with statues being tipped into the river or into the sea and all of that sort of thing. Do you think that maybe as a generation, maybe naively, we always thought that it was something that only really happened in America, you know, to Black people in America, and that we didn't really have all that much to do with it?
Oh, absolutely. I think, you know, the conversation around slavery is that it's always done by somebody else. And when it happened, you know, when we were involved in it, when the UK was there, it actually wasn't that bad. And, you know, and it's the myth of the great British Empire, you know, and this is a narrative that is continually perpetuated, that, you know, the empire was this wonderful thing that brought great, wonderful, amazing, you know, it made Britain what it is today. And it did. However, we never actually look at how that greatness came about and the unbelievable suffering that was caused to a huge number of people, and not even just suffering, the dehumanization of an entire race of people. And it can be seen in so many different ways. You know, it's a lot of people say, but, you know, I'm not racist, you know, I don't think that, but sometimes it can be the little things. You know, you see a Black person driving a really fancy car, you question it. I wonder what they do. I wonder what job they've got, because you don't expect a Black person to be driving a really fancy, expensive car, or you make assumptions, you know, drug dealers or something. And this is something that has just slowly been put into it. We see it in the media. You know, there's a point in the story actually where, in fact, the last story of Ahmed Sheikh, where the shadow man is speaking to the perpetrator of the crime and says, you know, you see that man over there. I tell you all the time, this beast, it wants to gorge, it wants to feast. And I'm really looking at, you know, how the narrative, how these misconceptions of people, we're constantly told, you know, we just feel that Black people are intellectually inferior. Black people are, you know, they're good at sport and they're very good at music, but we never really see any scientists. We never see any Black engineers. We never see any Black people doing any other involved in any other roles. And I think that's just a really simple place to start. You know, just in the schools, if you go in and you ask a child, tell us the name of an African leader, a good African leader, who's not Nelson Mandela, I should say, you'll be hard pressed to find any names coming out, because we're simply not told of the contributions that Black people have made across the entire world. You know, lots of inventions have been made by Black people. We find people in, you know, I think the film The Hidden Figures, and how this group of Black women really helped put people up in space. You know, we need more of those stories being told, and not to push the Black narrative, but simply present it as, you know, as a story. Because, you know, when we just normalize it, that people are able to do different things and have always done all of these different things, then that's kind of how you begin to change people's minds about certain things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Your illustrator, tell me about your illustrator, because the illustrations actually add an awful lot to the sort of the darkness of the shadow man and all of those sorts of things. So tell me about your illustrator.
So her name is well, it's actually pronounced Ellie Griffin, but it's written Eri Eri Griffin, and she's a Japanese illustrator based in Edinburgh. And we found her and just thought that her style of illustrating was just so wonderful. It was quite abstract. It's there's a lot of she uses a lot of ink, and she's quite messy with her style. She just spreads her fingers and creates these shapes, and then kind of adds sort of lines and the actual shapes to it. But she was just this really wonderful addition to the whole process. And it was interesting having conversations with her. There were sometimes illustrations came back. For example, there's a story about how fear came into the world, and this young man goes up to heaven and meets the gods. And when you see the feet of the gods, and it was very Greek god like, with their gladiator sandals and this. And I said, well, it would be really nice if my thinking when I told the story was actually based on the Orisha, who are deities, the pantheon of deities of the Ifa people of Yoruba, Western Nigeria, and who are quite similar in concept to the Greek gods. You have Olodumare, the creator, then you have the Orisha of war, the Orisha of the sea, the Orisha of fertility, and so on and so forth. But I didn't really want to have this Greek imagery happening. So we had this conversation, and we kind of shared images about the Orishas that we found online. And so she was then able to kind of, just put just look at them through a different lens and have questioning, have anklets and sort of, more leather and great brass bracelets that the Orishas are typically presented wearing. So yeah, it was interesting working with her.
So what's next? That's always the question, isn't it? What are you going to do next?
Well, this, I suppose, is just the beginning of Blood and Gold, which is quite exciting. So yes, I suppose just working on this just now, getting word out. But I've also been speaking to the Lyceum in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and just trying to make a bigger production of an actual stage show of Blood and Gold, incorporating more of the stories from the book into it. So just collaborating with them to create a new piece of work. And yes, of course, I have lots of ideas for new stories. One of the things that I'm really interested in right now is exploring that that kind of difference between sort of mental health and spirituality, and where do the lines cross? Because, we have, for example, people who are visited by the ancestors, and they feel the ancestors, and they, it's not just voices in the head, which a psychologist will say, tell me about the voices. And it's, well, they're not voices, and it's that conflict, I suppose, between culture and heritage and how we see the world and how we see beyond the world, and that invisible line that kind of separates us, the humans, from everything else that's out there, and how do we navigate that? So it's an area of interest just now, and I'm looking into maybe developing a new narrative around something like that. But again, I love myth. I love kind of stepping out and looking at things from a different perspective. So certainly it'll be in a similar vein, I imagine.
And did your daughter Imani, did she enjoy the book? Did she enjoy Blood and Gold?
Yes, no, she can be a stroppy teenager. So when I first asked her to read it, I was waiting for the shrug of the shoulders, and she actually said, "It's not bad," which for her was high praise indeed. So. So I think she enjoyed it, and certainly I think with the stage show, we had a lot of kind of youth groups coming to see it, and I think the idea of the Shadow Man really resonated with them as well, because when you're going through your angst, this voice is so strong, especially when you're kind of navigating that transition from childhood to adulthood, and all of these issues that are affecting young people right now with, identity and who am I and where do I belong and who are my people? And the Shadow Man really speaks to you very, very loudly at that point. So yeah, I think, she did enjoy it, and her friends have enjoyed it as well.
Well, thank you so much, Mara, for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed what I knew precisely nothing about. So I didn't know anything about you. I didn't know anything about your book or anything. And it's been a really lovely, dare I use that terrible word, journey through just the whole interesting, as I said at the beginning, part morality tales, part colonialism, all sorts of things put into a very accessible way of learning something which I didn't know an awful lot about. And to be perfectly honest, I'm probably one of the people who is guilty of not realizing, you know, the role of the British colonialism and Scottish colonialism in things like slavery. So yes, a really interesting read, and one which, as I say, I think will appeal to lots of people on lots of different levels, not just kids. You know, they're great, really accessible stories for children, but I think as adults, it certainly makes you sit and think who your own shadow man might be. And I think we've probably all got one lurking somewhere.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I don't have any message to leave people, because I always feel that, you know, we're at very different points on this journey through life. So yeah, I think people will you will find what you need to find in the book.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for participating in the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwells Bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors and supporters who've sustained the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it will be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge.